Yeah, I think the market is underappreciating the risk here. People are, one, discounting his ability to win the nomination, and I think there is reason to be skeptical. However, Donald Trump showed us 4 years ago that really the conventional wisdom doesn't always work out, and the unconventional candidate can prevail. And I think when the market looks at Bernie, they say, okay, if the senator does get the nomination and he does win, that we'll just have gridlock. But the reality is there's a lot that he can do on his own, and much of that would be bad for the market.
And I think part of your thesis is, if I'm understanding correctly, Jaret, that the idea that if the turnout is heavy enough to elect a President Sanders, that it might well be heavy enough to flip the Senate the Democrats' way and hold on to the House.
Yeah, it's really difficult to see how Bernie Sanders could win the White House and not have long enough coattails to bring the Senate with him. There are enough Senate seats that are in play that if there is that kind of turnout and that kind of momentum that can get a self-described democratic socialist elected as president of the United States, then I think you have to assume the Senate goes Democratic as well.
You've identified two stock groups that you think are particularly vulnerable to a Sanders administration. And of course, we're way ahead of ourselves here. But no, you know, it's only 10 months away or whatever the election is. One would be banks, because he wants to break up big banks by limiting their size, would effectively destroy the banking juggernauts like Chase and Wells Fargo and so forth. And another way is by restoring the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated conventional commercial banking and investment banking.
Yeah, those are two of his big priority planks on the financial services front. And when you look at his idea that banks should be capped at 3% of GDP, that pretty much would mean that your biggest banks, your JP Morgan, Citigroup, Bank of America, would have to be split into three. Normally, people would say, well, you need legislation for that. The Senate will never go along. But our argument is that you can do a lot through control of the regulators, both through onerous capital requirements that kick in as banks get larger, as well as actual use of systemic risk authority to address size. So I think that's very much in play if Bernie wins.
What about, Jaret, the housing market? There are a couple of different ways in which Sanders' administration could affect them, one of which is talking about federal rent control. Also, this idea that he would end house flipping by imposing different taxes on them. What are some of the impacts you think that sector should be thinking about?
Right. So, I think anything that requires legislation is difficult. So to come up with a federal rent control regime, it's a great talking point. But even if the Senate goes Democratic, I just don't see a majority for that. And, as Donald Trump learned, it's one thing to talk about things on the campaign trail, but Republicans couldn't repeal Obamacare. So the idea that Sanders is going to get things that are actually contentious within the Democratic Party done seem hard. And I would put rent control in that, as well as some of his broader legislative demands. What can happen, though, is he can use the FHA program and cut those prices and really steer more of the mortgage market into the government and out of the private sector.
There's a lot of price controls in the Sanders platform. A cap on interest rates, cap on fees at the ATM to $2. I'm not going to complain about that, but that's the federal government coming in and saying you can't charge more than that. And federal rent control. This is regulating the price of apartments around the country.
Yeah, well, he is what he describes himself as, right? He's a democratic socialist. He believes corporations have too much power. He has a requirement in there that companies give 20% of the equity to employees, and then employees be on the board of directors. He has a very different mindset than what we're used to out of either party. And I think the market hasn't adjusted to that yet.
Very much an activist government type. And his wealth tax rises up to 8% on wealth above $10 billion. So that would be I'm not going to cry for the person who has $10 billion. They would be paying $800 million a year in tax. Right, Jaret?
Right. Well, I wish I had that problem.
Yeah, right. It's a nice problem
like
to have.
you, I don't. But again, those are the types of policies where we tried really high taxes in the 1960s, and it did stifle innovation. Without the profit motive, people take less risk. And I do worry about the unintended ramifications of much of his agenda. That said, we know that this is what Bernie Sanders is, and if people vote for it, that's what they're voting for.
All right.